Mr. President, Wildlife Service. Mr. President, Wildlife, President, Wildlife Refuges, Wildlife Service, Wildlife Refuges, Wildlife Service, Wildlife Service, Mr. President, Wildlife Service, Mr. President, Wildlife, Refuges, President, Wildlife, President, Wildlife Service, President, Wildlife Service, Wildlife, President, Wildlife Service, Wildlife, President, President.
Mr. President, Wildlife Refuges, Wildlife Judge, Wildlife President, Wildlife Refuges, Wildlife Refuges, Wildlife Refuges, Wildlife Refuges, Wildlife Refuges, Wildlife, Mr. President, Wildlife Refuges, Mr. President,
Wildlife Service, Wildlife, Mr. President, Wildlife Refuges, Wildlife Service, Wildlife Refuges, Wildlife Service, President, Wildlife Service, Refuges, Wildlife, President, Wildlife, Mr. President.
Mr. President,
Mr. President, Wildlife Service, Wildlife Refuges, Wildlife Service, Wildlife Service, Wildlife Refuges, 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 Wildlife Service, Wildlife Refuges, President,
Mr. President, Judge Gorsuch, 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 President, Judge Gorsuch, Judge President, Judge Gorsuch, President of Judge.